It was originally called Somebody's Got to Do It. We changed the name to Dirty Jobs. It goes on the
For years, Mike Rowe, the charismatic host of Dirty Jobs, brought laughter, grit, and humanity to television. He stood shoulder to shoulder with America's hardest workers, cleaning sewers, shearing sheep, and shoveling sludge, always with that same warm grin and humble respect for the people who keep the country running. But behind that humor and charm was a man carrying a quiet pain, a story that few fans ever knew, and one that reveals the heartbreaking tragedy of Mike Rowe's life. To millions, Rowe seemed unshakable, the guy who could take on any challenge, get his hands dirty and make it look easy. Yet off camera, the pressure of fame, the toll of constant travel, and the emotional weight of the stories he told began to wear him down. Each episode of Dirty Jobs wasn't just about work. It was about people, many of whom were struggling, forgotten, or fighting to survive. Mike saw their pain up close, and it changed him in ways he rarely talked about. He's admitted in interviews that the show made him question everything: success, happiness, even the meaning of his own career. "You can't meet that many hardworking people who feel invisible," he once said, "and not start wondering what we're doing wrong as a country." But there was more to his sadness than just empathy. Behind the camera, Mike was dealing with personal losses, moments of deep loneliness, and the realization that his mission to honor ordinary workers came at a cost to his own peace. He became the face of American perseverance. But few realized how much he was struggling just to keep that image alive. Now, as he opens up about his past, Mike Rowe is finally revealing the pain he carried for years, and how Dirty Jobs wasn't just a TV show, but a mirror reflecting his own battle with loss, fatigue, and the burden of caring too deeply. Long before Dirty Jobs made him a household name, Mike Rowe was just a curious kid from Baltimore with a sharp wit and a love for storytelling. Born in 1962, he grew up in a working-class family that valued hard work, humility, and honesty. His parents, John and Peggy Rowe, were both teachers, compassionate people who taught him to respect every kind of labor, from the classroom to the construction site. "My dad worked with his hands," Mike once recalled. He wasn't rich, but he was proud, and that mattered more than anything. In school, Mike wasn't the kind of student who stood out for grades, but for personality. He had a voice that commanded attention, smooth, deep, and filled with warmth. That voice would later become his greatest tool. He dreamed of being a performer, though not necessarily a star. He studied communications, sang in the Baltimore Opera, and even worked as a QVC host in the early 90s, a job he later joked was the best acting training in the world. But even in those early years, Mike noticed something about fame. It was a game built on illusion. On TV, everyone looked perfect, polished, and untouchable. Yet when he visited his hometown, he saw the opposite: ordinary Americans working brutal, thankless jobs just to survive. That contrast would stick with him, and years later, it would define his purpose. When Dirty Jobs debuted in 2003, it wasn't supposed to be a cultural phenomenon. It started as a one-off segment on the Discovery Channel, showing Mike joining people in the toughest, dirtiest, most dangerous occupations imaginable. From sewer inspectors to maggot farmers, Mike rolled up his sleeves and worked alongside them, laughing, sweating, and sometimes gagging his way through every task. But what made the show powerful wasn't just the grime. It was Mike's respect for the people he met. He didn't mock them. He honored them. "These aren't just dirty jobs," he'd say. "They're essential jobs." The show struck a nerve in America, a country that had begun to forget about its blue-collar backbone. Suddenly, millions were tuning in, not for the mess, but for the message. Yet as Dirty Jobs exploded in popularity, Mike found himself caught between two worlds. On screen, he was the everyman, relatable, grounded, endlessly curious. Off-screen, he was dealing with exhaustion, constant travel, and the emotional weight of the people he met. "Every person I worked with had a story," he said later. Some of them were heartbreaking. They'd lost homes, loved ones, or dignity, but they never complained. That kind of resilience gets under your skin. Mike started to feel the burden of carrying so many people's stories, of being the voice for those America ignored. The show that had made him famous was also beginning to wear him down. He missed family moments, lost touch with friends, and began questioning whether the fame was worth the personal cost. At his core, Mike Rowe wasn't chasing celebrity. He was chasing meaning. And as his platform grew, so did the pressure to live up to the image that Dirty Jobs had created, the unbreakable, good-natured man who could handle anything. But the truth was, even the toughest jobs can take an emotional toll, especially when you're the one witnessing the struggles of an entire nation up close. In private, Mike began to confront the darker side of success, the loneliness of constant movement, the guilt of profiting from other people's pain, and the fear that he might be losing himself in the process. The man America saw as indestructible was, behind the scenes, quietly unraveling. Dirty Jobs was meant to show what America had forgotten about work. Instead, it began showing Mike what he had forgotten about himself. By the time Dirty Jobs became a television phenomenon, Mike Rowe had gone from a struggling actor to one of the most recognizable faces on TV. Each week, millions tuned in to see him crawl through sewers, shovel manure, or descend into mines alongside America's hardest workers. To the audience, it was entertainment, funny, gritty, and oddly uplifting. But for Mike, it was something much deeper. He wasn't just filming a show. He was witnessing the soul of working-class America. And it was breaking his heart. What viewers didn't see were the moments after the cameras stopped rolling, the quiet conversations, the tears and the confessions from people who had given everything for jobs no one else wanted. Mike met fathers who hadn't had a day off in 10 years, mothers working overnight shifts just to afford medicine, and families barely surviving despite their back-breaking labor. These weren't sad stories, he later said. They were real ones. And they stayed with me long after the episode ended. Each story added to a weight that Mike carried silently. He began to feel guilty for leaving after each shoot, for returning to hotel rooms and flights while the people he worked beside stayed behind in the same harsh conditions. They'd tell me, "You don't know how hard it is," he said. And I'd think, actually I do. I just get to leave when the cameras go off. They don't. The physical toll was obvious. Years of dangerous labor and extreme environments left him with chronic back pain, infections, and constant fatigue. But the emotional toll ran deeper. Mike began struggling with sleeplessness, burnout, and periods of quiet depression. He didn't talk about it publicly. After all, he was the tough guy from Dirty Jobs, the man who laughed in the face of discomfort. But inside, he was unraveling. At the same time, fame began isolating him. Friends noticed he'd grown distant. The same voice that had once brought humor to every situation now carried a quiet sadness. He'd see too much, one close friend later said. He wasn't just filming jobs, he was absorbing people's pain. Despite the strain, Mike refused to stop. He believed Dirty Jobs was doing something bigger than television. It was changing how Americans saw labor. It was making heroes out of janitors, welders, fishermen, and truck drivers. But the responsibility to represent those people honestly became an enormous emotional burden. I wanted to get it right, Mike explained. I wanted to show the dignity in every dirty job. But after a while, the line between their struggles and my own started to blur. The turning point came when one of the show's crew members, a man Mike had worked closely with for years, passed away unexpectedly. The tragedy shook him to the core. It reminded me that the people behind the camera are just as human as the ones in front of it, he said. That loss hit me harder than I expected. After that, the show began to feel different. The laughter came a little slower, the jokes felt heavier. Mike continued filming, but privately he began questioning how much longer he could carry the emotional load. You spend enough time around people who are struggling, he said, and you start realizing that the real dirty job isn't in the sewer. It's pretending you're okay when you're not. By 2012, Dirty Jobs came to an end, not because of poor ratings, but because Mike was exhausted. The show had made him a celebrity, but it had also left him drained and disconnected. I was proud of it, he admitted, but I was also broken by it. What fans didn't know was that Mike was quietly stepping away to heal, from grief, from burnout, and from the invisible scars that years of carrying other people's pain had left behind. The man America saw as indestructible had finally reached his breaking point, but that ending wasn't the end of Mike Rowe's story. It was the beginning of a transformation that would redefine not just his career, but his purpose. When Dirty Jobs ended in 2012, the world assumed Mike Rowe had simply moved on to other opportunities. In truth, he was exhausted, mentally, emotionally, and physically. The years of working grueling hours, traveling endlessly, and carrying the weight of the stories he told had finally caught up with him. He described that period as a strange kind of silence, where for the first time in a decade, there were no cameras, no flights, and no reason to smile for the audience. For a man who had spent years celebrating the value of hard work, stepping away felt almost like failure. He wasn't used to slowing down. When the show stopped, he said later, I didn't know what to do with myself. I'd built my identity around getting dirty, around connecting with people. Without that, I felt empty. The fame that once energized him now felt hollow. Despite his success, Mike struggled privately with self-doubt. He wondered if he had really made a difference, or if he had just been another face on TV. I met people who worked harder than anyone I'd ever known, he recalled, and I got all the recognition for it. That never sat right with me. For the first time, he began turning inward, examining not just what he'd done, but why he'd done it. The result was a painful realization. For years, he had been running on empathy and adrenaline, pouring himself into the lives of others without ever taking care of his own. You can only carry so many people's burdens before you forget which ones are yours, he said. Mike's lowest point came in quiet moments, alone in his house, reflecting on all the faces he'd met through dirty jobs. The miner who'd lost his hearing, the crabber who worked through pain to feed his kids, the farmer who smiled through tears as he talked about losing everything to a storm. Those faces don't leave you, Mike said softly. You carry them with you. But even at his lowest, Mike Rowe wasn't one to give up. He began writing, not for TV, but for himself. Short essays, reflections, and anecdotes about the people he'd met and the lessons they'd taught him. These writings would eventually become The Way I Heard It, a storytelling project that let him reconnect with his roots as a narrator and observer of the human condition. It was through this process that Mike began to heal. He also decided to do something radical. Instead of chasing fame, he turned his focus toward helping others build their futures. In 2008, during his Dirty Jobs years, he had quietly founded the Micro Works Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting trade education and skilled labor. But after the show ended, the foundation became his new calling. He poured his time and energy into providing scholarships for young Americans who wanted to learn trades: electricians, welders, mechanics, plumbers, and others whose work, as he always said, makes civilized life possible. This mission gave Mike a renewed sense of purpose. It allowed him to channel the empathy that had once burdened him into something tangible and hopeful. I realized I didn't need to be on TV to make a difference, he said. I just needed to keep shining a light on the people who never stop working. Slowly, the man who had once been broken by the weight of others' pain began finding peace in helping them rise. His humor returned. His writing found an audience, and through Returning the Favor, a Facebook series that honored everyday heroes, he rediscovered the joy that fame had once taken from him, authentic connection. Mike Rowe's comeback wasn't about reclaiming the spotlight, it was about finding balance. He learned that empathy without boundaries leads to burnout, and that even those who celebrate hard work need to rest sometimes. In his own words, Dirty Jobs showed me what people are capable of, but it also showed me my limits. I had to break before I understood what real strength looks like. The man who once stood knee-deep in sewage was now standing on something far more solid, a purpose built not from pain, but from gratitude. In recent years, Mike Rowe has stepped into a new phase of his life, one defined not by television ratings or celebrity appearances, but by reflection, gratitude, and a deep sense of purpose. The man who once spent his days crawling through mud and sewers now spends his mornings writing, mentoring, and speaking to audiences about the value of work, humility, and resilience. Yet even now, he admits that the shadow of those difficult years never completely disappears. "You don't just walk away from the things that shaped you," Mike once said. "You carry them, but you learn to carry them differently." The biggest shift in Mike's life came when he truly began to understand what his journey was all about. Dirty Jobs wasn't just a TV show. It was a mirror that reflected America's soul and his own. He realized that the people he'd met weren't just subjects for an episode. They were his teachers. "Every person I worked beside," he said, "showed me a different kind of courage. Quiet courage. The kind that doesn't make headlines." That realization changed how Mike viewed success. He no longer chased it. Instead, he began to value simplicity, good work, good people, and meaningful impact. His Rowe Works Foundation became the centerpiece of that philosophy. Through it, he's helped thousands of students get skilled trade training, reminding America that dignity isn't found in a college diploma or a corner office, but in doing what needs to be done, and doing it well. Mike often says that his foundation isn't about charity. It's about responsibility. "We've spent too long telling people the only path to success is through a 4-year degree," he explained. Meanwhile, the trades, the jobs that build our homes, fix our cars, and keep the lights on, are going empty. That's not just an economic problem. That's a cultural problem. As he travels across the country, Mike still encounters fans who thank him for Dirty Jobs. Some tell him the show inspired them to take pride in their work. Others say it helped them through tough times, reminding them that hard work has honor. Each story humbles him. "If I did anything right," he once said, "it was showing that there's beauty in doing the hard stuff." Yet, beneath his calm wisdom, there's still a touch of sorrow, a quiet acknowledgement of the toll his journey took. Mike has spoken about how fame tested his values, how loneliness crept in despite the laughter, and how empathy sometimes felt like a weight he couldn't put down. But instead of running from that pain, he's learned to transform it into purpose. "Pain doesn't have to define you," he said in a recent interview. "It can refine you, if you let it." Today, Rowe spends his days balancing storytelling, advocacy, and introspection. He continues The Way I Heard It, his podcast and book series, where he shares untold stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things. The series, much like Mike himself, carries a blend of wit, history, and heart. Proof that his voice still connects with those who believe in simple truths and honest work. When asked what he wants his legacy to be, Mike doesn't hesitate. "I just want to leave the place a little cleaner than I found it." That answer, both humble and profound, perfectly sums up the philosophy he's lived by: not to be celebrated, but to serve. The heartbreaking tragedy of Rowe isn't found in loss or suffering. It's found in the quiet burden of caring too deeply for a world that often doesn't care enough in return. But it's also where his triumph lies, in choosing empathy over apathy, purpose over fame, and gratitude over regret. In the end, the man who got dirty for a living didn't just show us how hard work looks. He showed us what the human spirit is capable of. Through every heartbreak, every hard day, and every lesson learned, Rowe has become more than a TV host. He's become a symbol of endurance, humility, and hope. And perhaps that's the real message he leaves behind. No matter how dirty life gets, there's always beauty to be found in the work, if you're willing to dig deep enough to find it.